Hi. Korg just released firmware version 2.0 for Wavestate, along with an editor and sample builder. I went ahead and rewatched my initial review when Wavestate first came out, linked below. And the tutorial part still stands the test of time, so I won't repeat it here. But my complaints in the pros and cons section were almost completely addressed by this update. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at the main things that are new, talk about a few tips and ideas to get you started making the most of it, and find a few other things to complain about. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Korg sent Wavestate over to review last year at no cost to me, but reviews are never paid. This channel is funded by people who subscribe to my book updates and content on Patreon, like the multi-samples I created in this video, YouTube Premium and ads, and affiliate links in the description which help the channel regardless of which product you choose to buy. Okay, let's get going. There are a ton of updates in Wavestate 2.0, but if I had to pick the top three, they're the editor, the ability to load in your own samples and multi-samples, and performance hold. Let's jump right in, and I'll start with the editor. Broadly speaking, a hardware synth requiring an editor is a weakness, not a strength. And for the most part, I think that Wavestate doesn't need one when performing patches. There are plenty of hands-on controls for that. However, with 4 different layers and 6 different sequencing lanes, if you want to get a bird's eye view of what's going on in a performance, whether it's a complex one you created, a factory preset, or a performance you created using the randomization function, the onboard screen is just too small and requires too much digging to show all that information at once. Unlike the panel, you can see parameter values directly on screen, including how the wave sequences move forward. Now you can see that on the little screen here as well, but you only get a representation of the different wave sequencing lanes. You don't see the contents inside those lanes on the small screen you do on the editor. The editor turns your computer screen into a screen that's directly and constantly in sync with whatever's going on Wavestate. Let's, for example, try out a different preset. Let's maybe try a different one. So in a preset like this, you can choose to even see more than 16 steps, 32 or 64 steps, which is a great bird's eye view for what's going on. The second advantage for the editor is that you can see parameter values, not only what they are as opposed to the knobs where you can't. You need to select a knob, turn it, and then you can see its value, but you also see modulation here. So for example, pan modulation or tune modulation over here. Now, a testament to Wavestate's user interface is that aside from the software being a huge screen for it, surprisingly, making many changes is still faster in many cases on Wavestate. For example, yes, you can see all the sample names here by category, which is useful if you're looking for a particular thing. But if you want to audition a specific sample, then you press it here, the list is gone, you need to click again and open the list again and find that again. Whereas if you're wave sequencing, you just choose the step, you can see the sample name over here, and then easily audition different steps just by flicking through them over here. That said, some things, of course, are easier on the editor. For example, simply adding steps and, say, selecting a number of steps, Control-C, copying them, pasting them somewhere else. So you get a feel for it. For example, if I wanted to change loop lengths, I need to go into timing and then go into the start and end buttons and sort of drag and drop them up and down here. Yeah, there's only one step here. So let's add a few, go back into here. It's a lot of mousing back and forth as opposed to, say, if I wanted to edit the start and end points of the sample lane, just click on the sample lane and start twiddling these knobs. You can see that change on the interface as well. Adding mod destinations, I think, is a matter of preference. So for example, I could go into the cutoff knob here and immediately see what's modulating it, but I don't think going into the mod matrix is that hard over here. You can't currently see the entire mod matrix on the software, so you can only view that over here. So you can go slot by slot here. Not much going on in this particular preset, but over here you can flick through the entire mod matrix. Assigning destinations here, I think also, again, on the hardware is just as easy, but you can flip through the different pages and say drag the filter LFO to a parameter just as easily as that. Create a mod destination, choose the intensity. So the editor is certainly a very welcome addition, especially if you're new to Wavestate. It's a great learning tool to learn this synth and explore the excellent factory presets, and a substantially better experience for creating patches if you have a computer nearby, as opposed to just playing them where the editor doesn't add much value. So that's the editor. The next big new thing about Wavestate 2 is the fact that you can import up to 4 gigabytes of your own or third-party samples into it. However, doing that isn't as easy as dragging and dropping samples onto the internal drive. It takes a bit of preparation using the new available software called Sample Builder. This lets you handle both multi-samples and banks. I'll get into why you need banks in a bit, but let's maybe start with a simple sample. So most samplers can run a single sample. This is a pretty long one. I can preview it here by playing the root note, and traditional samplers will play a sample faster as you pitch it up and play it slower as you pitch it down. And beyond an octave and more, it sounds cool, but it doesn't really sound like a piano anymore, especially if you pitch it up a lot, or even, an octave and a half. That doesn't really sound like a piano anymore, which is why the multi-sample was invented. So I'll load up a multi-sample that I created by sampling una corda from Native Instruments. The idea here is that you use multiple samples, hence the name multi-sample, for different regions of the keyboard. So for example, this sample is spread across this octave, and you can use obviously more than one sample per octave, but as we pitch this up, we'll swap it for the next sample in line, which sounds different, but still sounds like a piano across the range. Now, Sample Builder for Korg Wavestate supports only one velocity level across the piano range. Some other multi-samplers let you sample different velocities. Some will let you even round robin the same note. You can't do that within a core multi-sample in Wavestate's Sample Builder. You can, however, bring multiple multi-samples in and use the velocity layers to create velocity layers if you wanted to. You could actually also round robin samples using the wave sequencer. Sample Builder lets you import samples one by one or batch import multiple samples. If your multi-sampler inserts the proper metadata, the samples will just be organized automatically across the keyboard. But if it doesn't, or if you want to intervene, you can always change the original key on a per sample basis. Fine-tune it if the piano you sampled wasn't properly tuned. You can trim the sample, zoom in, and make sure the start point is where it needs to be. And you can also set loop points, which is pretty difficult to do manually. These are basic loop points. Just turn off one shot, and you can edit the start point like that, or like that, and then change the end point. It's very hard to create proper loop points without crossfades and without finding the zero crossings, which isn't supported here. So I wouldn't recommend trying to find loop points in the software. It won't sound good. Either use software that lets you embed crossfades or just sample long samples. You've got 4 gigs here, so you're not going to run out of space very soon. Loop points are, however, useful if you want to create texture samples. I'll talk about that in the tips section later on. Now, ideally, the Sample Builder tutorial would end here. You just hit a button to transfer multi-samples to Wavestate and then manage them using the librarian. Unfortunately, there's another step in the process called banks. Multi-samples aren't managed in the librarian, but rather in Sample Builder. The Wavestate hardware can only hold one bank of up to 4 gigs at a time. And you can't swap multi-samples in and out. You can just take a bank from your computer and overwrite what's in here. So as you save multiple multi-samples, you combine them in a bank. You can load multi-samples into a bank and export them if you want. My recommendation is be prepared to have a neatly organized folder on your hard drive and collect your multi-samples and banks there. Now, what if you want to combine third-party multi-samples with your own? Say, for example, download a few of the lovely multi-samples I'll post on my Patreon. Luckily, it's very easy to import third-party multi-samples into your main bank, and you can also create multiple banks, one for your multi-samples and another for some combination of your multi-samples and third-party banks. So, for example, in this case, John from Plugin Guru sent me a bunch of his multi-samples, quite a few of them, and it was very easy to just import them in. Like I mentioned, you can store up to 4 gigs of multi-sample data in a single bank. This bank RAM size refers to the list, the number of multi-samples. You can get up to, I think, 1,500 stereo multi-samples and 3,000 mono samples. So this is just a list, and you can see I'm sort of only very partially through what I can include in this bank. Same goes for storage. If you ever do run out of space, it's very easy to create new banks, and it takes probably around a minute to send a bank, certainly in these sizes, into Wavestate. Now, the last thing you need to know about sharing performances or importing them is that multi-samples are just sample files. They don't include any of the information in a performance, meaning filters, effects, LFOs, envelopes, modulation, not to mention wave sequences. So if you share or buy a preset pack and the performances are important, don't forget to include the performances that use those multi-samples to load them up, and you do that using the librarian software. So again, if I go into performances, I could sort by collection, go for, say, mine, or the, let's go for the Plugin Guru ones. So these aren't just samples, these are, let's go into the editor, full wave sequences and presets that use the Plugin Guru multi-samples in this case. So it takes a bit to get your head around the difference between multi-samples and banks that are managed in the sample builder and performances that are managed in Wavestate's librarian and editor. Okay, so those are, I think, the 2 main new features in Wavestate 2. I won't cover everything that's new. You can pause the video and take a look. But just to name a few more, you can now assign a scale to the pitch lane, which makes it easier to hit the right notes as you play with the pitch values. So you go into the wave sequencer, and then into the main pitch lane, turn on fit to scale, and then I might destroy this preset because of how it's set up, but if you want, you can quantize pitch to a scale. And this is particularly useful, I think, because currently you can't sequence notes using the keyboard, which would be a nice feature for them to add. So if you're transposing steps, they'll automatically be quantized to the scale. Another new important feature that I complained about in the previous video is that you couldn't hold or latch a performance. You could latch an arpeggiator, but you couldn't do that to a performance. So if you hit a few notes, it wouldn't stick. You could use a damper pedal, which I do have here, and then change chords. But you had to time the release of the pedal properly to get it to work. There's now a solution to both those issues without needing a damper pedal, though it's always nice to pair one. And you get to that by holding Shift and the arpeggiator, which now latches the performance as opposed to the arpeggiator. You can still latch the arpeggiator in the menu. Anyway, you get a pattern going. No need to hold the damper pedal, and then switch it whenever you want. Now you do need to be aware of sync notes. So if I have this on and start a pattern and don't time my swap properly, it won't sound good if sync notes is off. So you need to go to all the layers, turn on sync notes, and then turn on performance latch, and then things will be in sync. If I purposely try not to do it in time, it'll still be in sync as it should be. So cool stuff with performance hold. This, by the way, is as opposed to layer hold. This will be useful in a trick I'll show you in a bit, which is a good segue to the tips and tricks section of this video. So like I mentioned, one of the things you'll probably want to do now that you can load samples onto this is to multi-sample either your hardware synths or your software synths. Now, unless you have a lot of time to spare, you probably don't want to be sampling all of these multi-samples individually and chopping them. and so on. So you'll want to use an auto sampler or multi-sampler. The most capable multi-sampler I'm familiar with is probably Sample Robot, but it's pretty expensive. A cheaper option is MainStage if you have a Mac, and Logic as well. However, there's a pretty good free option in the free MPC Beats from Akai. Hidden in the Tools menu, you'll find an auto sampler. This won't be a detailed MPC Beats tutorial, but to sample an external instrument, a hardware synth, you'll need both a MIDI track and an incoming audio track. Then set the MIDI track to MIDI to send out MIDI notes. And if you're sampling a plugin, you'll just need the MIDI track and set it to plugin and load any plugin you want, including plugins from third parties. This is the Arturia Mellotron V. And then to start the auto sample process, you just go into the Tools menu and load up the auto sampler, set the minimal note, the lowest note, the highest note you want to sample, and the stride or the interval between the notes. 6 semitones is fine. Don't sample multiple velocity layers because the sample builder in Wavestate doesn't support it. Choose a note length. Like I mentioned, go for, however long you expect notes to ring out, then give them a tail. This is the gate stage and then the release stage. You can take a chance and enable looping or just make long samples, and then you won't need it. It'll tell you how long it'll take and just click do it. That's pretty much it. All the metadata will be in the files. Then you go into Sample Builder, hit Import Wave Files, select all the files in your Finder or File Explorer, and they should load up neatly, just like these samples did. Like I mentioned, you can do this for plugins, add effects to the plugins or external instruments, sample that into a multi-sample, and then bring that in. All that is nice. Another interesting use for multi-samples you might want to take a look at is using it to create drum kits. So this I just did manually. Let's load up this kit. I loaded up different files, individual files into Sample Builder, and then just set different ranges for each of the samples. I also set them, I believe, most of them to fixed pitch if I didn't want them to change. And what I did was load a kick here. So I didn't set that to fixed pitch, so I could play different tunings with it. And then these are the different samples. I also put a tom at the top of the range and didn't set that to fixed pitch, so you could play the toms. Don't forget to set the original key to the key you want to activate the sample at its original pitch. And once you import that into here, you've got a kit. Something you couldn't do, I think, previously unless you found a multi-sample like that in the library. And this is the pitched kicks and the pitched toms. Now this is useful for a couple of reasons. First, if you just want to finger drum on the keyboard with your own custom samples. And second, if you want to create a wave sequence out of this, you don't need to load up a different sample every time and look for the kick or look for the hi-hat in the long sample menu over here. Basically, all you need to do to choose a different sample, let's say for a pattern like this, is just transpose the sample semitones up or down to pick different samples. Now this works nicely if I hit my main key, but can also yield surprising results when you transpose it up and down. Let's move on. This next step is a bit of a stretch, but you can sort of use Wavestate as a Wavetable synth. As a matter of fact, if you've browsed the factory samples on Wavestate, you may have seen quite a few wavetables pop up. For example, this preset uses the ResX set of single cycle waveforms in the factory presets to create sort of like a wavetable synth. And you can see what is actually happening here is we're just scanning through the different single cycle samples. Now, to be clear, this won't replace your mod wave because you don't get many of the special features a wavetable synth has. For example, waveforms aren't phase locked, which can cause comb filtering in the transitions. You also don't get all the wave shaping features of mod wave or other wavetable synths. And another problem is that it takes a lot of time to manage individual waveforms. Let me show you a workaround for that though. So for example, here in Sample Builder, I took a sample of my self-saying loop operator, split it into 64 frames using Wave Edit, a free tool from Synthesis Technology, and then just threw caution to the wind and imported those wave files into Sample Builder. Now each individual cycle may not sound like much, but if I scrub through them quickly, that's sort of me saying loop operator. And then I just brought that as a wavetable into here and used an LFO to transpose the sample effectively cycling through the waveform. And just needs some work with smoothing, obviously. So not the greatest wavetable in the world, but sort of wavetable synth-like. I'm sure there's a more efficient or better quality way of doing that. If you come up with one, feel free to comment below or link to a video of you walking through the process. And then the final tip brings us back to the layer hold, not the performance hold feature, the good old feature from Wavestate 1.0, but combined with the ability to import samples using Sample Builder. So if you want to create phased loop style textures, it's now super easy with Wavestate. Take a look at this sample. I took a very simple 2-sample multi-sample. One is this little tune I made in my review of Plinky, and then another one is just a loop of birds. So just 2 simple samples, but I could have put way more samples here, and there's enough polyphony to handle multiple loops. Speaking of which, I set both of these samples to loop. So for this to keep going, make sure that you're not in one-shot mode on any of the textures that you import into here. And then what I did here was I brought the 2 textures into layer D, and layers A, B, and C are from the beautiful Iceland preset from the factory presets. So let's see how to get these textures going, because it's a little bit tricky. I can play the samples easily like this. So this is the Plinky intro and outro, and these are the birds, and I can play them together. But if I leave them, they'll stop. And if I hold the damper pedal, they'll stay held. But now I have to find a way to get layer D to stop listening to the keyboard. Otherwise, additional loops will be added, and I don't want that. I only want to add notes to layers A through C, not to layer D. So the workaround, and I'll just turn off these layers to simplify things, is to go into the Perform menu, the layer menu, and get the textures going. And you can do that either with a damper pedal, like I'm doing now, or if you don't have one, just turn hold on for the program, for the layer, not performance hold. And then we need layer D to stop listening to the keyboard. And the way we do that is by turning off the global MIDI channel and setting a MIDI channel to something that you know is not going to get any input. And now we can freely play any other layers without interrupting the 2 textures. And yeah, the textures will just keep looping as long as we don't stop them. By the way, if you do use the damper pedal, you'll need to make sure that these 3 layers are set to ignore the damper pedal. So RX damper off for layers A, B, and C, and RX damper on for layer D, which has my textures. Okay, so those were a few ideas to get you going with Wavestate. Let's take a look at its pros and cons in light of what's new in version 2 and the pros and cons in my initial review of firmware version 1. On the hardware side, the screen remains small and the menu divey, so that hasn't changed. But at least now you have the option to pair a screen with it if you have a computer around. Wavestate also still remains only 3 octaves without aftertouch, though Korg have teased a version with more octaves and aftertouch. So you'll have that option in the future, but it will probably come at a price. We don't know what that is yet. Other than those things, when I look at the cons in my original video, Korg pretty much addressed all of them. So my only further complaints are sort of like, yeah, but wishlist style features. So yes, we can import our own samples, but it would be nice if they supported velocity layers out of the box and crossfades, sound font files, and modulating start and end loop points. And yes, we have a software editor, but it would be nice if you could see the entire mod matrix on it. Though, like I mentioned, you can see that using the mod button fairly easily. But really, that's all I've got. Feel free to add your complaints or cons in the comments section. I think that considering the price and form factor, it seems like most of the issues I had were addressed. Korg Wavestate was a very unique synth when it came out, and is even more so now with this version 2 update. If you're into creating your own evolving sounds, rhythms, textures, nothing that I know in hardware form compares to Wavestate, and even if you're religiously against presets, you're going to have a hard time keeping the faith and not having fun with the ones in Wavestate, especially since you can steal only 1 or 2 layers and combine them side by side with something you create on your own. So that's it for Wavestate. If you'd like to download some of the multi-samples I made for it, as well as my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, consider joining the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the YouTube bell after subscribing to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.